This is the secret, untold history of how Charles Lindbergh was involved in the World War II Doolittle Raid. My research into this story has taken over 20 years, and it all started at this amazing event back in 2002, where I was privileged to meet Charles Lindbergh's grandson, Eric Lindbergh, who had just completed his own transatlantic solo crossing of the Atlantic Ocean. At the time, I was a freshly minted private pilot, particularly interested in engines and fuel management, and I'd also just read A. Scott Berg's book, his biography, Lindbergh, and that's fascinating. In a chapter about Lindbergh in World War II, there's a quote about Charles Lindbergh's fuel management techniques, which I think changed World War II. And this is the quote. After several more days of bombing missions, the crew chief of the 475th had noticed that Lindbergh's plane invariably returned with much more fuel than any of the others in the squadron. One evening, the commander asked Charles Lindbergh to explain exactly what he did. But stop, you can't actually do this story unless you understand America's relationship to Charles Lindbergh during World War II. He was famous worldwide for his solo crossing of the Atlantic in a single-engined aircraft. And Charles Lindbergh absolutely loved aviation and saw it as the future for humanity. At the time, one of the greatest innovators of aviation techniques was Germany. So they invited the world-famous Charles Lindbergh to Germany to look at their aviation innovations.
When Colonel Lindbergh arrives in Berlin, it is noteworthy that he flies a British machine, and the distinguished American aviator who is accompanied by Mrs. Lindbergh is naturally received with the honor due to a guest of General Goering.
But you have to understand what was going on in Germany. Germany had lost World War I and were forced to sign the Treaty of Versailles. In that treaty that Germany signed, they were banned from building up a new air force or army because the countries of Europe were worried about Germany fighting another war. But German engineering is amazing, and they secretly were working on new aircraft. Knowing they had to work under the treaty's restriction, they pretended their innovations were for civil aircraft and gliders. Of course, it turned out that that was a lie, and in fact they were building fighter planes and bombers. So they invited, as a PR exercise, Charles Lindbergh to visit Germany to look at their latest techniques. He was rightly impressed in seeing what they were doing, but he was wrong in ignoring the Treaty of Versailles. Charles Lindbergh should have seen through the ruse and listened to political leaders who saw Germany rising up again and possibly going to enter into a war. But he returned to America full of stories of how innovative German aviation was. The American press and public hung on every word Charles Lindbergh said. But politicians feared that the wool had been pulled over his eyes, and in fact Germany was lying about rebuilding an air force.
France has now been defeated, and despite the propaganda and confusion of recent months, it is now obvious that England is losing the war. And I have been forced to the conclusion that we cannot win this war for England regardless of how much assistance we send. That is why the America First Committee has been formed.
Oh, it's so interesting making a film. You set off with an agenda and started looking at the life of Charles Lindbergh, and I needed to find archive film of him saying that he didn't really believe that America should be involved in a war in Europe. And I was looking for footage of Lindbergh talking about how great German aviation was. But what I found was very disturbing. I had ignored or dismissed people's criticism of Charles Lindbergh as a racist, and that he showed a tendency to actually support German or Nazi regimes that were pro-Aryan white race. But now I've looked at the footage, now I've actually seen the things that Charles Lindbergh said in his rallies in New York with fascists, my views of Lindbergh have changed slightly. So yeah, sure, he was not keen for America to get into the war, and he was very pro the innovations that Germany was showing in aviation, but he was deeply flawed in his pro-white racial outlook on life. He actually said that America shouldn't get involved in a war against Germany because Germany were protecting the white race of the world. I mean, it was wrong, Charles, and I can see why he got himself into such trouble and was never officially involved in the US military.
Here is the motion picture record released by the United States Navy of the havoc wrought by the Japs' sneak sky and sea raid on Pearl Harbor, America's mid-Pacific naval bastion. On December 7th, 1941, Japan, like its infamous Axis partners, struck first and declared war afterwards.
World War II did break out, and after the disastrous attack on Pearl Harbor, the United States did get involved, but not with Charles Lindbergh. Despite Charles's unbelievable knowledge about aviation, he was just too controversial to be made a general in the US military. So what exactly did Charles Lindbergh do in World War II? Well, this is fascinating. He was actually a private contractor. He was totally patriotic and decided to fight and fly in the Pacific theater against the Japanese. But all the time, the US military actually really valued Charles Lindbergh's views on aviation. He would often test fly new aircraft, and they would listen to his opinion. I discovered an amazing document that really criticizes the B-24 bomber written by Charles Lindbergh. This bomber was the most produced bomber of World War II, and he just thought it was a bag of bits. He thought it was so old-fashioned and so badly built, but nobody listened to him. It was too late. It was already in production, and it went on to be a successful bomber, but it was rather old-fashioned. And here I get on to the most interesting thing that I found out about Charles Lindbergh. While stationed in the Pacific and fighting against Japan, Charles Lindbergh used techniques in flying fighter planes that the US Air Force didn't know about. He would return to his squadron's base with far more fuel left in his tanks than the rest of the squadron. The US Air Force pilots were all trained using standard engine and fuel management techniques. But Charles did something differently. And to understand what exactly Charles did, you have to go back to the Spirit of St. Louis. The Spirit of St. Louis was a flying gas tank The biggest problem other people had had in crossing the 3,000 approximate miles of the Atlantic Ocean was running out of fuel, and Lindbergh knew that. Just look at this picture of the cockpit of the Spirit of St. Louis. The first thing that everybody notices about this amazing aircraft is that it has no windshield. Charles Lindbergh knew that fuel management was the number one thing he had to master to be successful in crossing the Atlantic. So he chose to remove the windshield and put in an extra forward gas tank. In fact, the whole plane was a gas tank. The wings, under the seat, behind him, and in front of him was fuel. And just look at this panel. It's not about looking forward, it's all about fuel. The pressure gauges, the stopcocks, the timers. This is what Charles Lindbergh knew would let him cross the Atlantic. And what I'm about to explain now is the technique that Charles Lindbergh devised to increase the range of all aircraft that really works, and the US Air Force used his knowledge for the Doolittle Raid. So let's open this whole debate of how you manage an aircraft engine. And I'm going to keep it pretty simple, and I'll probably get one or two bits wrong. And I would like to thank two people, two wonderful aviation people. Ken Whitfield from Honolulu, Hawaii, who has been an aviation engineer all his life, and my friend Mark Recht, who's a wonderful pilot who understands aircraft and aircraft systems. So thank you, Ken and Mark, for this fantastically clear information about what Charles Lindbergh did and what the US Air Force did to save fuel and to fly faster. So let's deep dive into how you fly an airplane. So you've got an engine and a propeller, and it's very important to match the speed of the engine and the propeller. US Air Force pilots were trained in their basic training to match the engine speed, or the manifold pressure of the engine, to the propeller RPM. And that is the kind of square law. So for example, if you're going at a manifold pressure of 20 inches, you would be flying the propeller at 2,000. So 40 inches, 4,000, 50 inches, 5,000, and that's the square law. And they did that to protect the engines. But now let's talk about cars. So you're driving down the highway at, say, 70. And so to take the Air Force analogy of how they fly, what they did, what they were told was, in third gear, you can go this fast. In fourth gear, you can go at this engine RPM. And at fifth gear, you go at this engine RPM, and you never vary it. Well, you know, and I know, if you're driving a stick shift, a manual transmission, that you can still stay at the same speed, but change up, and the RPM will drop. And RPM drop means fuel saving. So it's quite possible to drive around at, say, 3,000 RPM in fifth gear and maintain 70 miles an hour approximately. And that's exactly what the US Air Force was not doing, but that's what Lindbergh did when he flew across the Atlantic. He saved fuel by slowing down the RPM of the propeller, taking deeper bites, by managing the engine in such a way that it would save fuel. And there's another enormous issue, and that's about mixtures. So back in World War II, there was lower octane gasoline for aircraft engines and for cars. And these lower octane fuels tend to pre-detonate. That means when the fuel is injected into the engine through carburetor or let into the cylinder, if the engine is super hot, it will explode while the piston is coming up rather than being ignited by the spark plug. And that pre-detonation, before it should explode, I mean, the spark is timed at the point where the piston is just about to go back down to absorb all the energy from the explosion. But if it pre-ignites when it's let in and when it should be being compressed, but it explodes during the compression stroke, it can blow a hole in the top of the piston or even break the cylinder wall or certainly cause valve damage. And that you might have heard that in your car. It's called pinking or knocking, and that's pre-ignition. And that can be solved by two things. One, you can increase the octane of the fuel. That means that it doesn't burn so readily. So it will take the compression and only be ignited by the spark plug, and higher octane fuels sort that out. Today, airplanes fly with 100 octane fuel if they're burning gasoline or petrol mixture, which is a high octane. Back in World War II, they were probably flying on, say, 80 octane fuel, which did have a tendency to pre-detonate or knock. What Charles Lindbergh did was he raised the engine temperature to a point that it didn't pre-detonate. So he was running the engine extremely lean but extremely hot, and that saves fuel. That's called running lean of peak, and that means there's less fuel going into the engine. So a combination of a lower RPM with a higher propeller pitch and lean of peak, meaning that there was more air and less fuel in the mixture, both of those added up to saving fuel. But there was a problem. The problem was, if you push both of those too far, you destroy your engine. And very interesting, Charles Lindbergh was flying this, the P-38, the Lightning, which happens to be one of the most innovative aircraft in World War II, with extreme cutting-edge turbo-powered engines. They were fantastic, but they did have some issues. The air intake from the turbocharger to the engine was over 12 feet long and convoluted and ductwork, and often they found that the seals on the joins of the duct weren't perfect and they were losing aircraft due to them being poorly manufactured. So that needed fixing. And the other thing they found is that they needed to increase the exhaust tube outlet. The turbocharger exhaust had to blow out with no restrictions, and they found that the jet blast from an exhaust on a P-38 added over 10% of the power to fly the planes faster. But what exactly was Charles Lindbergh's role in this? Well, again, as a filmmaker, when I started making this film, I made this bold statement that it was Charles Lindbergh that increased the range of the Doolittle bombers. I now believe that he's a very smart guy. He certainly used engine management very carefully when he flew the Spirit of St. Louis across the Atlantic a few years earlier. But I think I got it wrong for two reasons, and here they are. One is that the US Air Force at the Wright-Patterson Air Force Base was actually the people experimenting in lean of peak and fuel saving, knocking, high octane fuel and all of that. Charles Lindbergh knew about it, but the real research was done by the US Air Force. And secondly, and this really kind of basically makes the story not true, is that the Doolittle Raiders were B-25 aircraft, a very small bomber that they could manage to fit brilliantly on the deck of an aircraft carrier, as we all know. But I don't think Charles Lindbergh's fuel management techniques were used by the B-25 bombers because they have radial engines, and radial engines are much more delicate than the engine in a P-38 Lightning. And I think you really had to manage them, not lean of peak, not pushing the manifold pressure too much because they would blow up and break. So I now believe that the premise of my film is actually wrong. I think Charles Lindbergh did add some contribution to the war effort. I think his political views were dodgy, and I don't believe anymore that Charles Lindbergh actually helped increase the range of the Doolittle bombers. So thanks for watching. It's been a roller coaster ride making this film, but I want to be open, I want to be honest with you, and I want you to know the truth, because the truth is out there.